Some of you have heard some of this. We touched on it at our annual general meeting, but I'm going to go through this quickly as if you haven't heard anything, because I want to be sure the context for why we're doing this work is clear. We began to have some discussions about the need for some focused discussions with the national labs, probably going back to the workshop more or less this time last year. We've had some discussions after that. The main thing that we had was a meeting with as many of the national labs as we could round up around the middle of December. We had something like a 2.5-hour conference call. Many people on the call. It was part of a larger effort to identify and engage with consumers, but it was specifically focused on identifying a class or a group of users that we thought would have some common threads in terms of interest and things that they'd like to see the OpenFabrics Alliance do for them. But there was no mechanism for them to make these needs and desires known to us. Hence this first forum, an attempt to figure out some things that we could do, an attempt, frankly, for the OFA to try to establish some credibility with the labs, whom we hadn't kept up with as well as we should, in terms of ongoing dialogue and giving them comfort that what they wanted was in fact being acted on and was a priority of the OFA. So we had that first meeting. That first meeting resulted in the creation of 4 specific projects, which will be listed here. And these projects are now owned by actually 3 individuals. You'll see how it plays out in just a minute. The projects are important both because they'll produce legitimately important results in their own right, and also we hope that this will help, again, establish credibility for the OFA with the national labs, a not inconsequential benefit. We also think it's going to be helpful because the process I had in mind, right or wrong, but the process I had in mind was we had to take ownership for the projects so that these owners could then engage with people from the labs that self-identified themselves as being concerned about this and then would work with us at a more detailed level. So I think that form of engagement will also be helpful. So I see several good things coming out of this work when we do it together. So in this session, what I want to do is introduce the projects, and I also want to talk about a related question, which is how do we have ongoing representation of the national labs on the board specifically? Right now, there is no mechanism for someone being on the board who isn't already simply a promoter. And so we're going to ask an important question whether we should create something like that, possibly for the special case of a lab, possibly for other special cases we might identify. So with that, we identified 4 projects. I've explained why we think these are important. The first was on the IB router, and this was taken on by Gilad Shaner of Mellanox, and really we hadn't had a chance to get much done on this. As you know, there were important announcements made earlier this week, external announcements by Mellanox, and then the session by Mellanox yesterday. It basically draws here to see, does this now constitute a done, or is there further work? And perhaps, Susan, you might have some thoughts you can share with us. You are among the ones who've been most vocal in caring about this area. Then the second and third OFED versus, I'm sorry, I hate that term, Mellanox OFED. In the forum, we were told that there are reasons that one is used and reasons why the other is used, and we wanted to understand those reasons better and to see if really, if OFA was doing everything it could in terms of producing a robust OFED such that Mellanox was simply adding value as they saw a reason to do it and not fixing things that we should be taking care of within the OFA organization. And Frank, on behalf of the TAC, has agreed to look into this one. The next one is Linux OS support. This says discussion in the slides. That's a mistake. Frank did come up with some slides. But this also felt like something that could be owned by the TAC, and Frank will explain a bit more about that. And the final one is problems with OFED, meaning packaging, distribution, and so on. And this is being led by Paul Grun. Paul is a self-described, diagnosed novice in this area. So he's not coming in with any, sort of hidden secret solutions, but instead wants to work to understand with some guidance from you what the problem here really is, and then dig into this in a bit more detail. And then again, the last thing we'll touch on is the question of organizational representation by the national labs. So this is your slide, Frank, but 1 second. Dror, did you have anything specific you wanted to say about the router? Do you want to simply ask Susan if she has guidance for us? How best do you want to do this?
Yeah, so basically the router is pretty much available, and Liran and Mark presented that yesterday in the session. It should address the needs, but we definitely want to hear feedback about the session. We can definitely follow up on that. In terms of availability, then it's going to be GA next month, and that's pretty much at a high level. You pretty much reiterating what you already said.
I guess my comment would be that I wouldn't call it done yet. There's actually a couple of options now for routers. We heard about 2 yesterday. So I think the labs will probably do some testing and provide feedback to both of those entities. And at that point, we might be able to call it good, but not quite yet.
Okay, that's fair.
All right, thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Paul?
Can I ask you a question, Susan? Sure. The historical issue with routers has been that the IBTA never actually completed the specification of a router, and we still haven't to this day, as far as I know. My question for you is the existence of a couple of vendor solutions adequate? Is that okay, or is there more work that we need to do?
I think that depends, right? So I personally haven't looked at the specs. It seems like routing has been something people have wanted and people have talked about off and on for years. So I don't know that I'm the right person to speak to whether or not there should be an actual spec. We probably, it's kind of a little bit the carts before the horse already. So to do a spec now, we'd probably just have to go to the couple solutions that are out there and then try to backfit it, so it's kind of silly. So that's what I would say about that. We just need to see how they work and what issues we come up with.
Okay, Frank, you can either speak from there or come up here as you wish.
No, I'll come up there. My voice is probably carried without the mic. Now that everybody's had time to read this really thoroughly, I'm not going to read what it says, but essentially this seems to me as kind of a data gathering, and it's a curiosity exercise. I have had various people tell me they want it here, they want it there, they don't want it here. I know there's been past discussions about we're doing this right or we're not doing that right. And really, I'd like to hear from the users. And the way to do that is, since I'm not well connected with the labs, Susan is the person I know most, and that's only from a few phone calls. So really would like the TAC members who have contacts of the people who can really articulate it, because within the organization, I assume that there'll be multiple opinions. We should hear them both, because they may have different needs, production versus trying to set a speed record or whatever. And we have a number of opinionated people in the OFA, and that's a great thing. So send them on the TAC mailing list, or you can send them to me through the TAC moderator address on the screen. And then I need people to come together and let's just do this distributed. If I have to do it myself, it'll be next year, we'll have something to talk about, but I'd like to get something together quicker than that. And disappointingly, could be just coincidental, but the minute I put this on the agenda, poof, the TAC, nobody called into the TAC meeting except Jim and Paul, and they didn't want to take this on, they were trying to hand this off. So, if you're not a TAC member, you can still get a hold of me, but let's try to move on this. And it's not we're not looking to come to a decision for OFA. I just want to gather the data and see what we know. So, questions on this, if there's any?
I just wanted to make a statement more than anything. I think that the reason that a lot of the labs aren't engaged right now is because, to try and make it short, I think the labs felt like OpenFabrics got to a point where things were working and they all kind of went back and did other things. And there's been a disconnect. And I think at some point the laboratory, the laboratories can't just sit back on the couch and say, hey, we want this stuff fixed. They need to step up and provide developers. It's an open source community. You can't just say, hey, go fix this and not provide some kind of resources. Now, on the lab side, there's been a lot of money given from the DOE and the DoD organizations, and so, but that was a long time ago. So I think there's been a disconnect, but it is a two-way street, and so we need to get the labs more involved and get people participating on the TAC, but we need to also contribute, not just lob ideas over the fence and walk away.
We have to pull as an organization, and the labs have to stand up and help, right? Information comes from them.
So I echo Susan's opinion that there's an onus on us to provide more development contribution. If at a minimum, as Ira suggested, get voice, use case requirements, things like that, if we're not contributing actual, code prototypes and things like that. And we recognize that. There's a couple of definitions here, maybe clarification that we need to establish. So when we talk about the national laboratories, right, they're, Susan and I represent, one part of that, right, the NNSA side of that, right. There's also Office of Science, and I don't want to leave them out, right. We have NERSC and NRL and NREL, and they also need to be, they're also big users of this code base, and they need to have representation as well. And it's not for us to do that, but we can certainly help, right? There are other forums where we're engaged with them, and to the degree that we can, the degree that I can, we'll try to get them engaged. Also, there was a discussion the other night in the general meeting regarding SFS, right? Open SFS. The actual, I'm sorry, the expanding the OFED definition to cover, the entire stack, right? We don't like to use the term OFED, but rather the larger code base. And so there's a ongoing discussion about, how does that get defined? And I think that's an important first step. Is revisiting that, right? Not for the discussion here, as well as for the other things that we talked about that night. So, go ahead.
Two things on the issue of participation in the forum itself. The people that were invited very carefully. We wanted to have people with as much as possible like interests. If it's appropriate to cast the net wider, that's wonderful news. Just please help us know how to do that. I'm not ashamed of the ones that we invited the first time around, but if there are ways we can grow this group, that's just great news. I want to be clear about your mention of OpenSFS because it's kind of not obvious, and I want to make sure I understand it. The issue about OpenSFS had to do with Lustre and it being basically orphaned by the group that had it originally, Lustre being too important to let die or even become less than what it was. And so they created an organization with huge cost to join because they had to fund resources to keep Lustre running. They just had to do this, so their hand was forced. The question in terms of the OFA is whether we should look at some other form of funding such that we could sponsor development that goes beyond our current resources based on our current membership model. Is that a correct restatement?
Yeah, OpenSFS is really a larger discussion. Maybe the better discussion is just OFS, right? Just in the context of this, just that, right? That's OpenSFS is maybe something that we need to deal with
but
separately.
It comes down to the issue of some form of funded development, which is beyond our resources. They're a poor example, but they are an example where this was ponied up by the participants.
Yeah. So yeah, the point that I wanted to make was just maybe the definition of the scope of that larger project. OFS is important for for ongoing projects in this group. So that's
Got it. Frank, are you okay? Are you finished? All right. Yeah, that's you.
So actually the meeting was 4 hours. It went by so fast that it seemed like 2.5. But and out of that 4 hours, Jim, vigorously took detailed notes the whole time, and we sort of boiled it down. And there were 4 little quotes that popped up in the course of the minutes there that described this problems with OFED, so to speak. Not to say there's problems with OFED. That's the wrong way to say it, but. Apparently, these are direct quotes, came right out of the minutes of the meeting, but apparently various sites still do work to post-process OFED to get it to a point where it's usable by the labs. And it's still a struggle to get things into open source. And Ira, I think you have a lot of things to say about most of these points. Process is slow, and some good needed content is not contributed to open source, and so on. And we sort of boiled that down at the end of the meeting. We, on the fly with the OFA people who were there and the labs people who were there, we sort of agreed on these 4 projects that Jim has described. And this was the AR that came out for this particular one, was packaging, distribution, and so on, document obstacles to effective use of OFED, understand the need for, try to address the questions that had emerged there. So that was the kind of the question that was asked. It seemed to me that the way to go about doing this was, understand and document the existing flow. And the reason I say that is because, and it gets to the point that I think Chris just made right now. What is the definition of OFED? What is the definition, more importantly, of OFS? And I think those are things that if you asked everybody, I know the answer to that. But I keep hearing people say, use the expression OFED in ways that feel to me like that's maybe not an appropriate use in the modern environment. So the plan, at least from my perspective, is to start from the basics. Let's see if we can agree on terminology and what we have right now. It says down there how we're going to do this, that there's this energetic individual to bird dog this, and that will be me. And I have an ulterior motive for doing that. As Jim mentioned, I'm an absolute neophyte when it comes to things like building distributions and so on, which makes me both the best and the worst possible candidates to drive an activity like this. I'm the best because I'm not going to bring any preconceptions into it. I'm the worst because it means I'm going to hound Woody mercilessly to teach me how this stuff actually works today. Some of it's actually contained in Woody's slides, so my thought was to try to diagram some of that stuff. Anyway, the point was to sort of start from basics and make sure we're talking from a common taxonomy. Then understand in detail, this comment about apparently various sites still do work to post-process OFED to get it to a point where it's usable by the labs. And what actually is happening there, I don't know, but I plan to dig into it and see if I can find out what that actually means. And that's going to cost Ira some cycles, I'm afraid, but hopefully he's willing to step up and help out a little bit here. Understand where the existing process impedes the lab's work. So now that we understand what's happening today and what the labs think they need, we can talk about where the problem is and we can think about ways to go approach it. And then finally develop some recommendations for improvements to the flow, if that's even possible. If at the end of all this investigation it turns out there's actually issues there or not. So I'm going to dragon hunt. I'm going to go look for dragons and see if I can slay them if they exist at all. So to do this, it's going to require, as I said, an energetic individual, which is me, active participation from Alliance members. There's some very important code language hidden in here. And I think Susan alluded to it earlier. She said this a number of times. We are an alliance. It's not, there's the OFA and it's a vendor, and there's the labs and they're a customer. That is not the model. The model is we are an alliance, and we need the labs to act as alliance members to engage with this. And I'm comfortable, or at least hopeful, that that will happen, using this project to kind of drive that. And so the surreptitious intent here is to suck the labs back in, which of course is what this whole thing is about. And maybe engagement with the EWG if it turns out to be helpful. And if I can cause as much trouble as possible with the EWG, I'll possibly do that. There was one other thought I was going to offer, but it went out of my tiny little brain, so I guess it must not have been that important. So that's the general direction. Oh, I know, the other thought I was going to offer. One of the main motivations behind the whole idea of a National Labs Forum was to discover if the OFA has the appropriate processes and procedures and methods and mechanisms and environment to support a discussion with the labs to make sure that they are re-engaged in the way that they used to be. And the outcome, the fact that this takes a guy like me to go off and do this, or a guy like Frank to try to rattle the cages and get some TAC resources and so on, says that we do not. So that's an issue that I think that we as the OFA need to grapple with going forward. So anyway, that's where we are with that one. Any questions, comments? Anybody willing to help? Ira, raise your hand, please. He's ignoring me. He's really trying hard.
He's trying to ignore you.
It's a virtual handout.
It's okay. I know two things about Ira. I know his email address and I know his manager.
Is this with regard to who is willing to help? I meant to say this earlier and I forgot, but fingers are pointed at Ira to do things, and Christoph has both these guys have a lot of commit IDs associated with their names and emails, and we do not. And I mentioned this the other day. I'm actually taking back just to make clear to everyone that we're not. The goal is not just to be consumers. I'm actually taking back the action item to write recs for developers for our organization. So, and now is the time to do it. But so we're going to go back and make that effort and get that ball rolling so that we can contribute to the process. Now I have bigger dreams than I do power, so that's. Writing recs isn't
But it
the
always
same as
starts with
hiring
a dream,
people.
doesn't it? I want to be fair about one thing. The last edition of the National Labs Forum, the one that happened on December 18th, we intentionally, I think, did not send out a crisp agenda about exactly what topics we wanted to talk about because it was mostly a listening exercise. What did the labs need? So because of that, the labs didn't necessarily come equipped with people who are willing to talk in detail about this particular problem. So we blindsided them a little bit intentionally. So the fact that they haven't, piped up and said, here's 5 heads who can help with this is entirely understandable and almost to some extent expected. Ira, this is your chance to defend yourself.
I don't know if there's a defense for me, but so I might have asked this at every OFED conference or OpenFabrics conference for years, but all right, show of hands, how many people use just the distro software? All right, how many people use OFED as shipped by OpenFabrics? How many people use TrueScale IFS, which is Intel's QIB OFED distribution? How many people use MoFed? How many people haven't responded? How many people don't use any of this stuff? Okay. I mean, I think that's the key, is there is no one software except what is upstream. That is the only common source that we have amongst all of the users in this room,
And
both in the kernel and all the user space packages.
there's at least one well-respected member of the community who regularly reminds me that people should just be using what's upstream and be done with it. That's one point of view. And if that's the right answer, hey, I'm good with that.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that everybody has to use what's upstream. I'm just saying that that is the common source that we are all basing all of this on.
Yeah.
And so if you want something to change, that's where we have to start first. Users are a good point. We need to start with the user requirements. But like Christoph said in his presentation, then you drive that to the source and it flows down into the various distributions. That's how Red Hat runs. SUSE? Where's John Jolly? Is that how SUSE runs? Yep. So those two companies, they know how to do distributions better than anybody else in this room.
But for what it's worth, what you just said about, upstream is where it all starts, at one point was not the case. And we've changed that. You know, we made the river flow the other way a couple of years ago. And that, I have a sneaking suspicion, but I have no data whatsoever that may be a little bit of what's at the root of what's going on here, which is why I wanted to start out by diagramming the existing flow. Make sure we all understand that's the way it works today, because I'm not 100% clear that that's actually true. And if it is, that's great. Then
Just to clarify what Ira said.
turn the little switch on.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
When Christoph got up and complained about the last bug in 7.2, well, first it is fixed because we do have it in what we call Z stream. The patch came from OFA. It should have been upstreamed, and it wasn't. Okay, so it's not being followed, and you have to put it upstream first. If it's not there, it shouldn't be an OFA. Okay, period. It is the common source. It starts from the sources. Okay, and maybe we may not have in the distro, but that's just a beating of us to do our job, to get it done for the user, and the user just complains to us, and that's what we get paid for, is to do what the user needs, and it's got to be upstream. That's our very first question. Every single BZ, it'll get immediately closed down a NAC if it's not there. Okay, so get it upstream.
And so I think OFA causes a problem. It causes fragility of the overall ecosystem of the RDMA subsystem, because now you have two places where you have to look for solutions. And yeah, one of the
At
reasons,
least two.
Yeah, at least two, and then maybe other folks as well. But it's very necessary to focus all the efforts on one common canonical code base, and everything needs to be in there, and it shouldn't be withheld elsewhere. And also, I dispute that the OFAT is in any way an upstream distribution. All the components there have Git locations, and that is the upstream location where all the distros pick the stuff up. They don't pick it up from OFAT at all. I think it would be best if OFAT would be there for legacy support, and we should let it wither away.
So I'm really encouraged to hear this lively discussion. If anybody would like to help me with this, I'm happy to be the punch. My style in a case like this is to write down what I think I know, which, with the willful acknowledgement that I don't know very much, is probably wrong, and then to have people throw slings and arrows at me and I'll fix it, and iteratively we'll get closer to the right answer.
I'm not going to offer much help, but the one little bit of help it would be that if you manage to get everything into upstream, then you will relieve a lot of work, because it's a lot of work maintaining this.
I think that was sort of the conclusion that was reached when we turned the stream around and made it flow the other way a couple of years ago, whenever that was, 2 or 3 years ago, I forget. Okay, I'm raised and stirred enough pots here, I think. Thank you.
So the last issue is one of representation, ways to influence the direction of the OFA. And we simply don't understand exactly what the ask is. We know some of the national labs are members, and we think we know why they are. We know some of the national labs are not members, and we don't know why they aren't. We have people that try hard to speak for key people like Steve Poole. But we don't know exactly what it is that Steve wants. You know, we hear stories like there's no sort of budget line item for this kind of membership in their form of accounting. Their view of the world doesn't have a place for membership, tick box or something. So we just have to be more clear on what the ask is. There's no, sort of basic negative reaction to having a special voice for the national labs. We just don't know exactly how to do it. So we are going to be exploring this a bit more, reaching out to some of the non-members. Maybe, for example, we have one representative for all of the non-member national labs, and that one person polls their constituency, which we'll define, and they find out what their issues are. And that way, those of you for whom it's worthwhile to pay for membership are already on the board by definition. The rest of you have some kind of collaborative joint membership and representation on the board. A lot of ways we could do this. And as I mentioned to some of you at the annual general meeting, we're going through the horrible process of digging into our bylaws now. So now is the time for us to solve this, because this is not something you want to do more than you absolutely have to. So this is a very sincere statement, a desire for outreach to understand those that don't participate, give them a legitimate and a strong and an ongoing voice in the direction of the OFA through the board membership, which is the most influential place you can be. And we're going to seek the best guidance we can from you so we do it right. So that's our report on the National Labs work. Those are our 4 projects. This is our sort of goofy offer for participation and a sincere desire to hear from you so we can make these projects happen. Are there any final questions or observations?